hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jason Levine, and thank you so much for joining me today on the Friday Masterclass, where today I'm very happy to bring two very special guests, fellow Adobe colleagues, to talk to you about the Premiere Pro Best Practices Guide. Now, those of you watching across all the multiple channels, and especially our friends over at No Film School, over the last couple of months, we've done a lot of work around just the fundamentals of working in Premiere, right? Everything from the basics of starting a project, basic editing techniques. Next week, we're actually going to revisit some color. We've done a whole thing on sound and motion graphics templates and working in the Essential Graphics panel. And along the way, we've had a little, pieces here and there, and we've had some other guests talk about optimizing your system for different types of editing workflows and sort of just optimizing the process and using some of the things often buried kind of within contextual menus just to really make the experience of editing, scrubbing, working with After Effects comps and such better, easier, and just more efficient, regardless of the type of video that you work with. Well, this guide, specifically this guide, as he goes to pull up a URL, which you can access right now. And by the way, because Matt and Marjorie are going to be sort of calling out specific chapters, you can check them out and kind of follow along. It's awesome. This is something that's been in the works for a long, long time. And you've heard me say a couple times on the stream, like, I don't always love kind of this concept, of best this, best that. But these really are best practices. And the reason they're best practices is because the folks on the Premiere Pro and the video team have been working with, just enormous amounts of users in the broadcast and TV space, and really sort of to evidence what are the best ways to do these things. We always talk about, specifically when we're going through all these fundamentals, lots of ways to do the same kind of thing in Premiere. So these aren't like, the guide isn't going to give you a tutorial on every single way to do a specific thing. And actually, Matt's going to give us a little more information around that. The idea here is that these are just practices that this is one way to do it, but this way has been proven very effective for this kind of workflow. And I love that kind of stuff. I love someone to kind of also just tell me, do this. You can experiment, and there's always multiple ways to do things. But if you do it this way, this is kind of a tried and true, proven way that you're going to get, you're going to have some success in this particular workflow. So of course, I could narrate all day long, but I'd rather bring on two very kind friends and colleagues from the video team, Marjorie Sacks and Matt Christensen. Lovely to see you both. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Hi. So, and of course, as always, we're coming to you live across YouTube, Behance, Adobe Live, Twitter, No Film School YouTube, and LinkedIn. So a quick couple of hellos before we get started. Lean, Hillestead, Barkfeld, David Lewis. Oh, very nice to see you. Alexander Jerry, Matt Ledger, Richard Garvin, Diva, Mixon, Ben Yomatov, Avinash here from India, Reverb Mike, Jenny Monteleone, Eugene Nowie, Tim, Reverb, Z by HP, Annika, Steve, Badge 99, Sam Peterson, what's going on, and Hamza Perkins. Great to see you all. Thank you so much for joining today. So, Matt, Marjorie, I'll let you decide who I want to start. Maybe, Matt, you can kind of start with this one. I think you wanted to. So tell us why did the team write this guide? I just talked about, again, the difference between sort of these are best practices and like, hey, here's 10 different ways to do this operation. What was kind of the impetus for doing this? And how does this differ from the kind of stuff that people can already find or have experienced on just like regular Adobe HelpX?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's probably best to start with what Marjorie and I do on our team. So, there's a lot of different arms of Adobe, people working in support, people working on sales, people working on the actual apps and everything. And Marjorie and I work on the engineering side of things. So we are the team that makes Premiere Pro as well as the other related video and audio apps. And Marjorie and I specifically work on a little sub team of that we call the engagements team. And we focus on engaging with the people that use Premiere Pro, and so both Marjorie and myself have a background in the industry in LA. And so we bring the sort of higher end use cases for Premiere Pro and working with editorial teams and all of that expertise and experience into what we develop for those features. So, some features are no brainers and great for everyone. And some features are really for specific workflows. And that's where we tend to focus. So that is why we made this guide, right? It's a lot of our time is spent working with these high-end customers in film and TV And we realized we were having a lot of the same conversations, right? Hey, we're going to start this new show. What kind of computer should we buy? How should we set it up? How do we work? How do you do this type of thing? And so that was really, I mean, it's a little bit self-serving, right? We wanted to be able to give someone the same answer and not have to have as long of calls about it. But it's also just something that then can scale beyond what our team is able to do, right? This guide can go to people around the world who have never talked to us or would never have the ability to. And so that's, I think, what we're most excited about, is to kind of really let everyone know how to do these kind of workflows in Premiere.
Yeah. And Marjorie, maybe you can follow up on that too, because I know this is an area of expertise for you. This is specifically, I mean, of course, these workflows can really apply to everything, but the spin on this really, it's mainly for like episodic TV and sort of longer form editing.
Yeah, generally for episodic and long form. And basically, it's more of a guidance. When you're shooting, any type of production, typically you always have a pre-pro call with like the directors, the production company, and editorial. So now like this is another way of like, how are you going to be setting up the project? What kind of hardware do you have? What kind of machines are you using? And then it can just really be, so you don't run into any issues along the way and you know everything in advance.
Nice. Now, I know one of the things that we were talking about the other day is that the guide, before we dive into it, the guide is huge. It's, I know it's well over 150 pages.
It's 134, something like that.
134. Okay, very close enough. So I just lost the Price is Right. Always overshoot. All right. So 134 pages. Are people kind of expected, if you're someone who really loves to read like manuals, are you kind of expected to read all of this, or is this really, again, sort of very specific compartmentalized things? I'm sure everybody could learn something, but what's kind of the thinking around this?
Well, that was one of the fun / difficult parts about making this is, I'm not an expert like document maker but by any stretch. And so even sitting down to edit this, right, we had to do it in chunks because it's so big. You couldn't sit down in an hour and edit the whole thing. So no, I wouldn't expect anyone to read it cover to cover. I did have someone reach out on Twitter and say it was like the latest Stephen King for him. So everyone has their own thing. So, but no, it's really
quite the endorsement. Yeah,
it's a reference. And so if you maybe are coming from another editing platform and doing your first big job on Premiere, maybe you will read more of it and kind of like digest it and soak in it. If you're already an expert in Premiere, it's maybe more of a reference to keep on your desktop and flip open when you need to check something, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and then that kind of segues into, and by the way, I just want another quick shout out to Bonjour, Monsieur Leger. My apologies. We started, you mentioned how you sort of started this guide around Premiere Pro Productions. Now, this is something we covered, I think, before we started doing this series with NFS back in February. Carl Soule and I have done a couple streams on here kind of showing and showcasing the workflows of productions and why productions. So maybe both of you could kind of give us a little insight into so why was that kind of the start of this, and why is that chapter in particular sort of a major theme of this whole guide?
Yeah, so Marjorie and I were, like I said, one of the things that our team does is work on features like this for editorial teams, and productions is one of the biggest that we could have ever done. And so a lot of that time developing productions was Marjorie and I going to visit customers. They would maybe even try, beta or even alpha kind of builds that was definitely still needed some work. It's a little bit of hand holding, and we were getting incredible feedback from them. And as we were building productions, we realized this is such a big shift from how normal projects work in Premiere. Clips can live in other projects and you don't see them in the panel that they're in the timeline, all these kind of things, that it wasn't going to cut it to just sort of release it, maybe have a little article on our help page about it. No one was going to be able to try it and really understand it. So we realized, as we were getting to the end of the feature, we really need to document this. And so that's what led to, okay, let's treat it like a full documentation. And I think that was maybe a 20-page. And that was really a team effort, including Carl, and other people on our team and everyone's expertise to kind of bring it together. And that became, as we were finishing that up, we're like, this is really like a chapter of the broader discussion.
Something larger. Yeah.
All these customers we work with.
Yeah. So Marjorie, now just on that same thing. So like there's a whole section in here about hardware settings and, again, sort of best practices for editing. And this comes up all the time. I think this is one of the first bulk series of questions when we brought on, particularly with NFS, is like, what do I really need to work with the, to work in this environment, specifically with Premiere. And maybe you could touch on that, because again, sort of, there are, I imagine, I'm aware, there are differences between what are sort of recommended on
Right.
site, and maybe you could kind of talk
Yeah,
to that.
I mean, we try to be, as general as possible, but there are, specific system requirements, and depending on the type of codecs you're using, you're going to want a, more powerful machine, things like that. So that I think is helpful. And then we also kind of went back and forth, like all of these little caveats. I was like, I think we need, like, before you even get started, here are a little, all these little nuances of things that when customers reach out to us, we're kind of getting the same questions over and over. So that really kind of helped us shape these things, because we're just, the more we can share with the user and set them up for success is what the goal of this was.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I've said this a lot, and I'm I'm very frank about this stuff. Whenever someone asks, like, well, on the site it says you can have 8 gigs of RAM or whatever. And then, of course, my next question is, well, what are you shooting with? And in the last 6 months, very commonly, not only because of, mobile phones and just how most things are defaulting now to 4K, but most people are shooting in 4K. And if they're working with something like an iPhone 13, they're probably taking advantage of ProRes 422 HQ, maybe HDR. So it's like, well, yes, you could do that. Then of course they ask my spec, and like, well, I have an older machine, but yeah, it's the toppermost of the poppermost, just filled to the brim with RAM and everything else, because the experience will be better. I mean, sure, it's a lot of it's, I think that gets lost sometimes when we talk about requirements. It's like, yeah, what resolution are you working? What are you planning on delivering in? How many cameras? Are you doing multicam? And it's not that you couldn't make it work. I keep around sort of an older Windows laptop to do a lot of my Windows testing, and it's not super powered. I think it has 16 gigs of RAM, and it works great. And it has like an older NVIDIA video card in there, maybe 4 gigs of RAM on it or something. But I wouldn't imagine myself doing a full feature on there, but I'm also not making full features. And I can still do very comfortably sort of 4K if I know some of those other best practices for, dropping the resolution, playback resolution settings, in the program monitor, and using proxies, which you cover in length in the guide as well. And I think it's never just one thing, right? I mean, yes, the system requirement is part of it, but there's other practices in that process that also help kind of enhance the performance and experience of kind of cutting in Premiere.
Yeah, and I think that chapter, we're talking about chapter 3, the hardware and settings, by the way, was one of my favorite to write, because I also love the low level nerdy stuff about how computers work.
Right.
There's a not too different alternate reality where I just became like a electrical engineer, computer science nerd person. And so rather than just, you could list the recommended specs for Premiere in like a little paragraph, and cool, go buy that computer or something. But what we wanted in this chapter was to be someone more like me who might be curious, why are you recommending this over that, or up to this level and don't go below that? So we, in that chapter, we have a little summary that says, if you don't care about the nerdy stuff, here's what we recommend. But then we go through each component and say, if you do care about that, here's why. Here is how Premiere uses the GPU and why that matters. And that's just also important, because it acknowledges that while we're providing what we consider the best practice for most people, when you have this information, you can then say, well, my workflow is different because of X, therefore I don't care about that, because you have this information. So we tried to be as transparent as we can be,
Yeah. Yeah, and again, and I imagine, specifically, it's always a thing with hardware and settings, especially as rapidly. I just saw yesterday, right, the new M2 MacBook Pro. I don't know if they're shipping. I just saw an ad for one. I only just got my M1 not so long ago.
I just got mine last week.
Of course you did.
I love it.
Of course you did. Yeah, it's so good, right? It is great. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is you're always, to some degree, you're always, you're feeling like you're playing a little bit of catch up, because yeah, development, especially in the hardware space these days, seems to just, and software too, but it's almost impossible unless you're just always an early adopter. Yeah, I mean, I know I have a couple friends. My colleague Terry, he's always on it. He always has the latest. I'm usually 2 OSs and two chipsets back before I make the
We're on the
leap.
M0 right now.
Yeah, right.
The thing to keep in mind too, like a good example is with GPUs. We had for a long time, we may still have it, like a recommended list of supported GPUs. And there's a lot of confusion about that because people, rightly so, I would put this maybe sort of on us, but think that, well, this is the list of the GPUs that work in Premiere. And, oh, I bought this new computer. I don't see it on this list. Therefore, it's not supported and doesn't work. And it's very much not that, that's not how hardware works. It's a platform, and our code talks to that platform, and then that GPU conforms to that platform, and everybody's happy. We don't have to know about every new thing that comes out. And so that's why I'm really excited for people to get into this chapter and say, okay, this is how the GPU is used, rather than just trying to look for like a rote match. I have GPU 9600 XT, and if that's not on the list, then bad things,
Right. Yeah. Hey, so if you could, Matt, because people are asking about the link, I've got it up. And so just to remind everybody, it's adobe.ly, that's .ly/Premiere Pro Guide. And that's going to take you to an Adobe HelpX page. Matt's going to pull it up here. I'm going to just pull up his screen real quickly so you can see.
Yeah, so let me just show you coming in from the other way. That link takes you straight there. If you were to just go to the Premiere Pro user guide, you can just search for that anywhere on the web. We've got all these sections on the left here. If you go to Getting Started, we have a page just for this, and this is where that link will take you. You got a Get File button there to get the PDF, just like that.
Yeah. So this is where everybody's going to land. You can see long form and episodic workflow guide. That's what we're talking about today. Matt Christensen and Marjorie Sacks. So while we've got this on screen too, maybe we could talk a little bit about this. And I see a lot of people are talking about, since they've gotten their M1s and things, they're very happy. This is slightly off topic, but I think it relates to this. And there's a couple of people asking. So do you touch upon sort of the Mac OS versus Windows OS at all, or any best practices around operating systems? Is there some stuff around that in here?
At the high level, the answer is we support both transparently.
Sure.
We don't prefer one over the other. So there's not really there's not a section that's like which is best, because we wouldn't say that. But there are some considerations and situations, especially with productions or networked shared storage, where you might have both a Mac and a Windows system collaborating. And so that is covered in the productions chapter.
Okay, very, very cool. So just on that now, skipping around a little bit, I know you wanted to highlight something which has come up also recently, particularly as we kind of make Premiere Pro, and this sort of, we saw this in real time last year when we acquired Frame.io, and of course many people had already been familiar with using sort of that Frame.io extension in Premiere, and it's the concept around sort of panels and integration, but more importantly, how not only can you leverage third-party creators for this, but there's a whole thing in Chapter 11 about how you can actually author a panel or make a panel to work inside of Premiere. Maybe one of you could touch on that.
Yeah, I think maybe Marjorie, you could talk a little bit about what you see. I'll give a quick high level, and you could talk about, how our customers we've worked with them on some panels and things.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that a lot of people have no idea this is even an option in Premiere. And so we wanted to have a short, sweet little chapter on it. It's not going to teach you how to code, but it does walk you through what you can do in Premiere Pro. And we have this whole concept of extensions and plugins. And plugins are things you might think about, like a video effect, right? Or to make a new camera format work in Premiere or something like that. But custom panels are really a way for a developer to make, just like you can have a source monitor panel or the timeline panel, to make just another panel, kind of like what Frame.io used to be before we integrated it into Premiere Pro. And it's basically a website that can then issue commands and work with Premiere. So you can make it do all kinds of stuff. And I'll let Marjorie kind of speak to it, but that's very common. It's pretty common in your high-end editorial rooms to find people who are also interested in scripting and coding and stuff, and can use that to put together something custom that can shave hours of time off their work.
Yeah, so several high-end customers, we've been able to help them integrate panels that specifically for metadata, sharing that with VFX vendors. And so they're able to copy and paste metadata on these clips and then send that out and bring it back in. So that's been very helpful for their workflow. I had no idea when I was in editing that there were these panels that you could integrate. So yeah, these can be very powerful if you have somebody that can write code and you can build a lot of automation into your process for like a lot of repetitive tasks.
Nice.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
so
we-
if that sounds like you at all, even if you're not a programmer now, be like, I'm not, I get the idea. Let me try it. We have on, let's see, this is page 133, how to write a custom panel. So it's at least the kind of 5 just high level things to get you started, and then some additional useful links to go from there.
Nice. I'm going to pull this off for 1 second. Some people were saying that the Adobe Lee is going to the adobe.com homepage. That is because, friends, you must respect the capitals in the Adobe Lee. And we can blame somebody for that. But it is adobe.ly/P Premiere, capital P Pro, capital G Guide. You are correct. If you do it all lowercase, it will just go to adobe.com. Apologies for that.
I think that's on me. I should have made the lowercase one too.
Matt. Well, you're a kind soul for admitting your extreme wrongdoing, sir. Thank you. No, it's all good. Capital P, capital G, adobe.ly/Premiere Pro Guide. Sorry for the confusion. Thank you, Amelia, for that little heads up there. Okay, so while we're talking about this, some people are asking, can we talk about techniques? So again, this whole thing is based around long form and episodic editing. So Marjorie, I mean, what chapters can we kind of point to talk about sort of editing process and techniques for this kind of workflow?
Oh, geez. Let me look. The getting started definitely, I think, has a lot of helpful information in that, depending on, how technical you want to get. But like working with dailies is definitely very important. If you set this up properly, take the time up front, you're going to have a very smooth process. And then the turnover chapter is very useful too. And we have a lot of, great suggestions in there for workflows, how you're going to get things for conform, for color, for mix, to outside to other vendors.
That's awesome. Yeah, actually, that's something we covered just a couple of weeks ago too. So wonderful that there's now. In fact, that was one of the last things I think someone asked after one of those streams, which is, do you have like a transcript of this? And I said, well, no. Now we do. Yeah, that's great.
I think that the dailies is a good example of something that's different from how from if you are only cutting by yourself or smaller projects that just aren't part of a larger pipeline. So that's in chapter 4, and that one actually, of all the chapters, spends the most time talking about things outside of Premiere Pro, because it's sort of it's one of those things that that process starts, like Marjorie said, at those early calls, maybe while they're still shooting or before they've started shooting, to say, what format are we shooting to? What's the workflow going to be to create dailies? And when we say dailies, we mean you have your original camera files, which may be in some kind of more difficult to edit format or complex or really large format. And dailies just refer to taking those original camera files, transcoding them into something like a ProRes or a DNX that's very easy to play. And then that's really all Premiere sees. Premiere doesn't even know about the original files in most of these cases. And that means when it goes out of Premiere at the other side, which is a turnover, there needs to be a way to get the edit, which was against the dailies in Premiere, connected back to the original camera files.
Right.
And so that's why it's so important that your dailies are set up right. You don't want to find out after 6 months of editing blood, sweat, and tears into your timeline, and you go to turn it over to find out it doesn't link. And so that's why dailies are so important. We have a whole chapter on it where those kind of techniques are essential to these kind of workflows.
Yeah. I mean, and also I think especially as, and I'm finding over the last couple of months of doing this, and as we're seeing sort of an even broader audience, a lot of people weren't necessarily using that specific vernacular, but the concept of doing just that, again, particularly as just larger rasters and just, more sort of raw style media is being implemented at the start, people were already kind of doing these workflows, but that was the one thing that I think eluded a lot of people was, one, having not set it up properly, not knowing really an efficient way to connect back to the master media, and then oftentimes assuming, because it wasn't like, where do I do that with, maybe not in front of their face, that we were doing it wrong. So having this as a reference is so great, because this is something we've definitely had many, many questions about, and I think we make it a lot better today. It's certainly it works super well, but discoverability is right. That's a challenge in any sort of product that has lots and lots of stuff.
And I find when I go just to Google and enter something, a lot of the stuff that's the first to pop up is dated. It's from much older versions.
Right.
So this is kind of just a one all of the information is in one place, and it's very up to date. And we'll, as you know, the program continues to evolve, we'll continuously update this document as we add features and updates.
Yeah, so that was actually my next question for you, which is that, a lot of times these things tend to kind of not die in isolation, but they're written at a specific point in time, and then, as frequently as we do sort of update. So is there a plan like for actual per release check-ins? I mean, again, this doesn't necessarily affect every chapter, but I imagine some things over time will need to be sort of revised. How are we kind of working towards that?
So we made sure that basically the way we're going to do it is on the table of contents. There's a little date at the bottom that says updated on this date. So that's sort of the version, if you want to think about it like that. And then as we want to make changes, we on the team actually can do it completely independent of releases. So if we write a new chapter, right? Oh, everyone's been asking about this thing, we didn't cover it, here's a new chapter, or change one word or explain one thing, we can basically do it whenever we want. So we're hoping to keep nice and nimble with it. And, it's not going to be like a once a month there's a new PDF to go check out, but we're not beholden to any limitations on that. So we want to keep it fresh and keep it updated pretty regularly.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. And that, again, that just kind of speaks to some things. I don't say some things never change. Some things are sort of just rote. They are what they are. Again, maybe the button location may change over time, but ultimately the workflow is the same. But yes, in particularly where there's so sort of specific things that we've done differently, I imagine a good case in point, although you probably have it, I know it references the new one, proxies, right? We just added all these sort of new little cool things, auto watermarking and stuff in proxies. Yeah. Those are the kinds of things that we'd likely see little updates for when appropriate, right?
Exactly. And also at the same time, a key thing about this guide that we touched on but didn't exactly say is, and this is tough when writing it, is we're not trying to have this PDF be documentation, right? So documentation is here's what every button does and why you do it, and kind of the filling out every corner of the app. And this guide is a best practices guide. So if it's not common for these kind of workflows to use that new watermark feature, for example, with proxies, then maybe we won't even add it, even though it's new, because we're trying to keep the guide as big as it is, not to get too crazy big either, right?
Yeah.
So it's really about that best practices and workflow we would recommend. So only when there's changes or updates to that streamline.
Nice, love that. Okay, so we've got about 25 more minutes. So I was going to ask you now if there's any sort of specific chapter call outs you wanted to go to. Maybe, I don't know if Matt, if you or if Marjorie have anything that you just wanted to show in Premiere specifically. Again, thinking ahead, this is, and we've got only a couple more streams on the NFS channel, by the way. And, as more and more people are sort of figuring out that it's really, there's accessibility to creating sort of longer form stuff. You can do it all, right? You can do it all in the system that you have today. Any specific chapters that you want to call out to kind of help people get into that mode? I'm finding that a lot of people, to your point, it's not meant to be like a help-ex guide. It's really just best practices. I think people just kind of want little inspirational things that kind of help them know that they can do this. So anything that you could point to specifically?
I think the chapter that I would recommend everyone start with is chapter 2, before getting started. And I wanted to call out a specific thing there because there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty about it.
Do you want to share your screen?
Oh, sure.
You want to pull that up on your screen? Yeah, I'm watching what you're doing before I pull it up. So
go for it.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so here's the chapters, the before getting started. The idea behind this chapter was, as we were writing everything else, you can see it sort of follows the post-production process, right? We're getting our hardware and settings, we're getting our dailies in, we're considering proxies, we're building our project, et cetera, et cetera. And as we were writing this, in each chapter, there would be a thing where like, man, this is a really big one. We see people have questions about this all the time. Can we bold it? Can we underline it? Can we, call it out in a flashing light? And that's really what became the before getting started chapter, which was like, let's keep a short, sweet chapter here. That's just, even if you feel like Premiere, start with this one and read it. And so it's a lot of, things to maybe watch out for, but also just things you maybe don't understand how they work. And it's key to know how they work, right? Things like GPU drivers. But the one I wanted to talk about was merge clips, because it's something that comes up a lot. And it's also maybe not really understood. why merge clips is a problem for these specific kind of workflows. And that's what I really wanted to kind of hammer home is if you are doing your entire edit in Premiere Pro, merge clips is great, right? By all means, go for it. But what can happen sometimes if you are going to send your audio out after you're finished to a mixer and something like Pro Tools is if you use merge clips, then those you're basically combining a video clip and an audio clip, right? And they each may have overwriting metadata, like they both have a time code or they both have a tape name or something like that. When you create a merge clip, we throw out the audio one and keep the video one because a clip can't have two of the same thing, right? And so that can bite you if your audio mixer then is trying to use the audio portion of that metadata to link up against the rest of the thing from set. So you can already see we're kind of out on a branch on a branch on a branch with if you're doing this and you're doing this and you did this, then you can be kind of stuck and it's not a fun place to be in. And what kind of has happened is a few people have been down that unfortunate path, gotten burned by it, and it's sort of become like a thing. Oh, merge clips is bad. Well, that's why it's bad for that one specific thing. And we call it up front here. But I just, I respect it in your workflow, but understand that it's not, it's not some big scary thing. It's just, hey, if you're going to send out your audio after you're done with your edit, don't use merge clips. And instead, you can use the multicam feature, which even if you don't have multiple cameras, just one video, one audio can still totally work and sync your picture. And then when you send out the audio in that case, it's able to flatten and kind of decompose back to the separate audio metadata and separate video metadata.
Nice. Yeah, actually, we're just talking about someone who was working with multicam, and I know there's a whole section in there around multicam, hoping one of you could touch on that too, Marjorie. But that merge clips and multicam, and again, these things tend to still kind of elude a lot of, especially new users, and particularly if they are working with people outside of the kind of Adobe ecosystem. So anything specific in the multicam section here that, we've covered now multicam twice in this series. What can people learn from the multicam sort of suggestions in this guide?
A lot. Just different ways of syncing it, different instances of how you're going to be using it and setting it up. I think, the difference between, merge clips and multicam, I think there is a lot of confusion with that. But multicam can be very powerful, like we tell you, like, if you need to go back and edit it, this is how you can do it. Little pointers along with things like that.
I think the key thing too is that this one was the chapter that took the most.
Yeah.
It's long, but we probably cut half of it. Honestly, it used to be twice as big because it was very easy to turn this into, like I said, documentation versus a best practice.
Right.
And I think if you've ever tried multicam and been a little confused by this, big dialogue here with all these settings, take a pass through this chapter because it is, like I said, rather than the documentation you can find on our help page, this is like a linear progression, like follow this through this and do this. And it actually, even for me, very experienced with Premiere's multicam, it was kind of refreshing to read the just creating multicam section here and just kind of go through it. So if you've ever felt like you don't quite get it, there's a chance that reading it in this format with this sort of straight through goal will unlock that for you.
Yeah, and because modifying the audio channels too. Like a lot of high-end customers will come in, they only want to be cutting with like the stereo or like the first the main camera, or the main audio. So this goes in and tells you how to do that.
I love that. Yeah, I was just going to say, in fact, in that first panel, create multicam sequence one that you were just showing Matt a moment ago, the most common questions are around, do I use the sequence presets? And then when there's that like camera audio drop down, that tends to be misunderstood. And in particular, because there's so many options. And now that even, we're seeing a lot more users who are not necessarily in the episodic space, but who, understand the concept of having better audio. So they're capturing secondary audio. Where does that fit in? There's a lot of confusion. And then right there, the sequence settings like camera one, all cameras, switch. Wouldn't I want to switch? Well, if you don't understand really what that does, probably not. These things come up a lot, and I love that you have it broken down in this way. Again, not to be, it's if you follow it in this kind of linear progression, you'll be successful in achieving what you're trying to do with multicam.
Exactly. I think a big takeaway too, in the broader document that we mentioned a few times, especially in the turnovers chapter here, which is one of those things I think even if you're an experienced editor and know Premiere Pro, if you've never worked as part of a bigger editorial pipeline, turnovers are the kind of thing you've never had to do before. So we have a section here to talk about how to turn over to an audio mixer, how to turn over to colorists, and how to turn over to visual effects. It was an interesting chapter because even on our team, between Marjorie and myself, we've worked in different areas of the industry, and what you do in those areas is different. So it was tricky to write, thou shalt always, check this box, because the reason there's a checkbox is because sometimes you need it and sometimes you don't. So again, this is another chapter where kind of like the hardware, we went a bit into explaining what those options are. And so we said, here is a good default if you're exporting AF, but check with your audio facility for their settings. And that was a theme in this chapter that's really big to take away too. We even made it this whole first page here, which is just basically like the best thing you can do to ensure success is to communicate with the teams that you're working with, right? And that's sort of the difference between a solo editor working on a project by themselves versus someone working in the kind of workflows we're describing here. Is you're part of a team, and every decision that you make impacts multiple people else downstream. Right. And so it's always best to communicate. There's never, you should never just follow this guide blindly, and then if it causes a problem, but the guide said too. It's like the guide said, make sure everyone's on the same page first, right?
Yeah, send them over tests, a test EDL, a test AAF, XML, and just so everyone has this expectation of, okay, we know what to expect when this comes through.
Yeah, and that's something that I try and emphasize too when people are asking that. Well, I did an AF or an OMF or something and it didn't work, and it took me this hours to export this huge thing. Try a small sample, right? And I'm glad you're stating that here. We say it and it seems obvious, but it's not obvious, because you're like, well, I want to do this should just work, do this, and that can obviously eliminate a lot of headaches down the line. Two other chapters I really wanted to highlight too. So first and foremost, and this came up actually just a few weeks ago when we were doing stuff around motion graphics, is the chapter on dynamic link with After Effects. And in the last couple of years, particularly on the Premiere side, right, we've made that certainly way more efficient, right, by having, and maybe you can speak to this directly. I don't know how we're messaging or languaging, that's not a word, how we're using language around this now. We have essentially that After Effects render engine in Premiere, so that as we scrub something that's dynamically linked, it'll cache those frames and begin to play back, right? I mean, that's one of the fundamental things that we've done differently in the last couple of years, but I think it's still kind of misunderstood, like how that works. And again, when AE is offline, and what do we sort of touch upon in here that they're not going to find elsewhere?
Well, I think what we touch upon is, I think especially for me, a lot of when I was learning Premiere Pro in school and, learning about dynamic link, it's like, well, that's cool. But I felt like I always had to kind of stretch to find a reason to use it. Why don't I just do it in After Effects and export out my video? The reality is dynamic link is huge for our film and TV and broadcast customers. Famously, David Fincher's editorial team, who we work really closely with, use it all the time for every little thing. If you look at one of their timelines towards the end of their projects, there's more dynamic link clips than not, right, in their timeline.
Right,
because they're combining two takes to get something to look right. They're maybe retiming a little bit of an action. So everything is kind of composited. And, that's night and day difference for them. If you took away dynamic link, they would just be like, what do I do?
The workflow would fall apart. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we talk about some of those sort of advanced things in here, and the additional tips, like how to have a guide layer. So you can send the background plate into After Effects, but then mark it as a guide layer so it doesn't get rendered, but you can still see it. Some tricks like that. Things like the color settings, which as Premiere Pro is starting to grow its color management support.
Yeah.
There's a little trick there to make sure that the colors match between the two. So we kind of document that there. So little things like incrementing the After Effects project file names sound silly until you're there in your 300th dynamic link clip, and you're like, that's where the kind of things can make or break your workflow.
Nice. Now, Ale was just asking if there's a chapter or a paragraph about the communication between other softwares. And I mean, I imagine a lot of that's covered in there's a section on AAF, right? In terms of interchange formats. How deep do we go into sort of external workflows. You both kind of touched on this before, but I imagine a lot of that's in that AAF chapter.
Do you want to take that one, Marjorie?
Go for it.
You don't want to take that one. I would say, yeah, so turnovers is the obvious one because that's where you're taking your timeline, sending out to color, sending it out to visual effects, sending it out to audio. But actually, there's the incoming side too, which is working with dailies. And remember, that's when I said there's actually, we have like the glossary here explaining all these 3-letter acronyms, right? What all these things mean. There's a dailies workflow. And it's only actually down into the sort of back end here where we're even talking about what you're doing in Premiere, right? All of this stuff above is sort of pre-Premiere. And I bring up the ALE because that's probably the maybe least known to people outside of the industry, but most common in the industry way to get stuff into your editing program. And this is how you get your dailies in. So we document how the ALE file format works, what it looks like, what kind of fields Premiere Pro supports. It's kind of, think of it like a glorified spreadsheet. And so we have this documentation here about this is what Premiere expects the column to be named, right? In order for it to come in, here's the kind of data it might have. So this is a common industry format to move sort of batches of clips around at various points in the editorial process. So this is all kind of a first too, to have this much documentation about our ALE stuff kind of in a guide for people to check out.
Right. And Marjorie, you mentioned too, I mean, obviously I'm sure there's bits in here about working with EDLs, and I saw up above you're kind of defining the XML format, right, for other apps. So, I mean, the main thing I think is people don't necessarily know which one of these, and I love that we're actually calling out Avid specifically. There was a time, right, where we wouldn't have done all of that, but realizing, particularly in this format, in this editing world, yes, we're sharing tools. I did a series back in CS4. I think it was one of the first times we started calling out Avid, and it wasn't DaVinci yet, but certainly Blackmagic and Final Cut. It was called Share the Love. Yeah. And it was all about our exchange formats. And back when Flash was a big sort of export format, right? And you could do Flash export media encoder. So people who were using other software that wanted to do Flash video ultimately had to sort of come over, they probably had, it wasn't the license then, it was still boxed, but they would sort of use media encoder to take their renders and then create FLVs from them and things like that. So it was kind of that was a very primitive time back then. But I mean, here now we're really going into the details, like you said, around ALE and just a lot of these sort of more modern exchange formats and really diving deep into how to make this all work.
Yeah. And we test all of that too. And we know that, like, maybe you're not going to stay in Premiere all the way till the very end or conform or do the color in there, and you're going to send it out. So yeah, we make sure everything works with these other vendors. That's the beautiful thing about it, right?
Nice.
Yeah, and it's a big part of what our team is focused on. A lot of the Premiere Pro engineering team, they're working on the new import mode and making H.264 exports faster, which everyone loves. But our team is the one digging in with like, this weird ALE isn't working right. Let's figure out.
Yeah. Now, Nakia is asking, and I think we kind of answered this before with productions, but do we go into team projects? So Nakia is asking, does the guide show how two different people can edit the same project? So I imagine that's talked about in productions, but do we go into team projects and some of like the team and enterprise offerings as well in here?
Yeah, we have a section in the productions chapter that talks about why you might choose one or the other, right? Team projects is good for this, production's good for that. We don't have further documentation. The guide doesn't really talk about team projects for the rest of it. And that's mainly because we had to make a hard choice between, again, what is the best practice kind of workflow for long form episodic teams working on a thing. And the reality is almost all of these higher end workflows are working off some kind of shared centralized storage, right? Whether they're remoting into those machines or whether they're physically in the office. And at that point, once you have a shared server between your system, even the team that works on team projects would say probably productions is the best bet there, because
is the way to go.
Why involve the internet if you don't need to?
Right.
But that doesn't mean that people doing film and TV are not using team projects or are not out there. But we kind of, again, that might be a future chapter is what I would say. It would be team projects for this kind of workflow, but it's not in there now.
And that's a good segue into the sort of remote and cloud workflows chapter. And in particular, sort of a lot of questions we've been getting recently. You just mentioned again about like, well, shared storage, cloud-based storage. There's obviously been questions recently like, are we going to start doing a lot of cloud processing, cloud rendering for effects and things like that? what sort of things are you touching upon in that chapter?
It's a sort of a lighter chapter again, because it could turn into its own 150-page guide to,
Yeah.
to describe everything. And what our goal here was, and it's a rapidly changing thing. So I would expect this chapter to be changing and kind of growing over time. But we wanted to offer, Adobe, we have this whole video partner program. We have a link to it here. And this is a way to sort of, we have all these partners that Adobe where we work with, and they work with us, and you can filter by them here at different business categories and everything. And so this chapter is sort of for remote and cloud workflows, a little description about how they work, how they integrate with Premiere, and then a list of some of our recommendations basically from the partner portal. And so that's the idea behind this chapter.
Okay.
It's still a space that's growing so much and changing so much that, we didn't go full hog into a 50-page chapter on it.
Sure. Yeah. And again, like to your point, we had Lucid on not so long ago, again, talking about a lot of solutions. And of course, they're among many that are great. But yeah, I think people are always really interested in that now, especially as, we're seeing even with some of our own, it's a little different, but sort of moving into products like Express, where, we're offering sort of quick action video things, tools, processes that are all sort of web and or cloud based. So I think this is very much on the mind of people who are just creating in 2022 in general, especially as everything gets more and more remote. And I think we can even attribute some of that to Frame.io and Camera to Cloud, right? I mean, just the idea that we're shooting on a device, it's automatically going up into the cloud. I get to Premiere, everything's there waiting for me, that kind of concept. Very much on people's minds.
Yeah, and I think big picture, a lot of the stuff that's in this document is not new, right? It's ALEs are pretty old, like you said.
Right.
Dailies is a film term, right? People were making dailies when they were shooting on film. Turnovers are pretty solid. So we're describing the best practice that already exists. And I think when it comes to cloud and workflows, this is all so new. There maybe isn't yet a best practice that all productions that are using cloud stuff work. That's also part of the reason the chapter is less descriptive of a single path forward, because it doesn't quite exist yet and it's always still changing.
Yeah.
And I think it's very project dependent too.
Absolutely.
So one project, even if you're at the same company, you may use this one solution for this particular project and then something completely different. We saw a lot though during like the height of the pandemic, people were like, how do we use productions? We're in different locations. Can we still do this? So everyone had such creative ways they were using this. So we kind of were like, oh, we need to definitely start revising this chapter of like how you can work in a decentralized workflow too, and still get the collaboration aspect from it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny that came up recently, and I had someone on Twitter ask me about, now, again, it's one of these things you think sometimes we just kind of making this stuff sort of, we never want to live in a vacuum, but sometimes we do get very hyper-focused on certain things. Somebody was asking me about Adobe Anywhere the other day, and that they had seen me, and it was either me and Carl or me and our old colleague Joost Vanderhoven show at IVC some years ago. And they're like, yeah, I've been looking for this, again, sort of during the pandemic, and somehow never caught. I remember Carl and I did a bunch of things around productions then, or team projects especially. But it is, that whole space is constantly evolving too. I mean, this is something that I'm always very frank about reminding everybody, is that it's amazing now. And if I have to hear one more commercial about the speed of 5G, I'll barf all over myself. But all of this is evolving, right? So, and as it evolves, things get better and they just get more efficient and they just make more sense to perform a lot of this. You're seeing a lot of this even in our design products where, we're adopting, cloud documents, across a lot of the design apps. And of course, we've had some questions recently. When are we going to do the same with sort of Premiere in that kind of sense? And, I imagine the line there as well. It's coming, right? It's just, inevitably it's in the works, but, it's also at pace too, with kind of everything that's happening and the workflows that people are doing and whatever it requires, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So we have about 5 more minutes here. So we've been answering and kind of answering things along the side here. Any other specific things that you wanted to call out in here, and just to let people know, and maybe we can kind of wrap too with like, where do you recommend people go outside of course streams like these, to get help, to get sort of additional information. Obviously, HelpX is great and very, very deep. Someone mentioned, Matt was saying that today was the first time I heard the word discoverability. Thank you, Matt. That is an actual word. I've used several non-words today, but that is a real one. But where would you say, where do you recommend people go to sort of learn more, find out more, get help? Right, so they have this guide, but where do they go for
resources and tutorials chapter at the very end of the document.
Okay,
that does have a lot of these sources. There's some books. There's links in there. We have Masterclass links, different types of blogs.
Yeah, I was going to point that out. So the last chapter of the guide is resources and tutorials. So it's exactly where do you go from here. And I wanted to give a special call out to Yarle Leopold, who was one of the co-authors of this. Right, it's such a gigantic piece that we've written over many years. It's hard, you can't say one person is the author. We all contributed. Sure. But Yarle did an outstanding work. You know, he's pretty handy with InDesign and did most of the layout and took it from a basic Word document into a properly laid out nice manual. And you know, we relied a lot on his experience both in that kind of layout and in using Premiere Pro. So there is a link to his site, which has a ton of stuff, and he's got a whole book on Premiere Pro. So I wanted to give him a shout out as well. So all of that is in that chapter at the end on resources and tutorials.
Nice. Now, if people wanted to, again, I think a lot of times we sort of rely on the socials for people to voice opinions. And recently I had a discussion internally, right? So, we have our user voice online, and of course we have the Adobe forums. If you wanted to point people where they can just go and kind of talk to, and especially as we sort of see our audience is growing using the betas, which any Creative Cloud user has access to on the video side of things, what sort of properties there do you recommend people go to? Forums, user voice, like where are we wanting to point people to go to, especially for things like feature requests and again, some of these tech things that are kind of updating before our eyes?
I would recommend the forums because that's where it's most easy for most people to reply, because a lot of times the answer can come from someone else. It doesn't have to come from us at Adobe directly. So that's the benefit of the forums. And I will say, it's tough to keep an eye on everything. It would be a full-time job and a half to keep up on everything on social media and the forums. But people like Marjorie and myself do make time out of our week to go check the forums. And so, while we might not reply to everything or most things, we see everything, right?
Yeah.
And so we're able to kind of spot trends, or if I see someone who asks a good question but no one's answering, I'll try and chip in. So, and especially if it's a specific thing about any of the stuff we're talking about here, how do I do X thing in Y workflow to make Z happen? That's the kind of thing that I would definitely respond to.
Okay. I love that. Well, Matt and Marjorie, want to thank you so much for joining today. I want to remind everybody again. Now, some people have said they're going to that URL with the capitals and it's not working. Most people are saying it is working. So I'm testing it over here. I don't know if it's a country issue in some places or the universe is just having a laugh. There's just so much traffic. It's just bouncing to some other place. But I did put the long form URL in the chat over here, and we can include that. I'll make sure that that's also posted directly into the YouTube versions of these videos. So again, want to thank you both, Matt Christensen, Marjorie Sacks. If people want to find you on the socials, do you give those out, or are you not into giving those out?
I do, but I don't have a fancy thing like you to put it underneath.
But,
right. My Twitter handle is the very good mouthful of _M Christensen. So
okay,
I think if you search for Matt Christensen on Twitter, you'll find me.
Mine is the Marjorie? Premier Princess.
That's right.
Very nice. Very nice. Just because, yes, Matt said it, I'll just throw mine up there. There you go. I'm at Beetlejace, of course, courtesy of a motion graphics template right there.
Wow.
Very nice one. Yeah. We like to drink our own Kool-Aid here at the Adobe Live Masterclasses.
I had one other thing I wanted to throw out too, which is that we are almost finished translating this document into the 9 languages that Premiere runs in as well. So
Nice.
keep an eye out for those. That'll just sort of seamlessly be uploaded to the site, so that if you are, in France or something and you browse to that link, you'll be given the French one. So
That's the version you'll
working
see.
it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, excellent. Yeah, what a wonderful note to land on. So yes, translations coming for the guide. Also, another opportunity to point out that if you're using our transcription and captioning feature in the latest edition of Premiere Pro, more language packs in there as well. So people are asking about that the last time. I think it was pre-NAB when we last showed that. So there are more languages in there. It's absolutely a wonderful workflow.
And if you use that and you haven't been checking out the beta forum, you should check it out. There's some really cool features that we're testing out in beta there around the text panel and what you can do with
yes, right. I don't know how much we could say about that.
It's on the
In
beta
any
forum.
case. Oh, it's on the beta forum. Okay, great. Excellent. Well, there you go. All right. Well, my friends, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone watching across all the various networks. We will be back next week with another episode. And until then, have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And we will see you again next time. Thanks again, Marjorie. Thank you, Matt. Take care, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jason.
Bye.